So at this point, I don't think it's a secret that both political parties are complete sellouts to large multinational corporations. The difference, however, is that the Democratic Party, they still try to lie and obfuscate the truth about their relationship with large multinational corporations, whereas Republicans don't really hide the fact that they're just corporate sellouts anymore. So, for example, to show just how brazen the Republican Party is with their relationship with big business, there was a vote that came up to repeal Obama-era FCC regulations that prohibited telecommunications companies, internet service providers, from selling your personal browsing history without your consent. Now, this benefits nobody but Comcast, Verizon, the most hated companies in the country. So you can't really support something like this, even if you are a gigantic corporate sellout, because how are you going to explain this vote to your constituents? I mean, you can't. You just look like a complete fraud. You look like a sellout. However, the Republican Party is so shameless in their corruption that they actually decided to vote to repeal these Obama-era regulations. They literally made it legal for Verizon and Comcast and AT&T to sell your internet browsing history without your consent. They have no shame. So Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept explains, House Republicans voted to free internet service providers, primarily AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon, from the Obama-era FCC regulations barring them from storing and selling their users' browsing histories without their consent. The vote followed an identical one last week in the Senate, exclusively along party lines. Now, to kind of give you a broad sense as to why this matters, it's hard to overstate what a blow to individual privacy this is. Unlike Silicon Valley giants like Facebook and Google, which can track and sell only those activities of yours which you engaged in while using their specific service, internet service providers can track everything you do online. These companies carry all of your internet traffic and can examine each packet in detail to build up a profile on you, explain two experts from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Worse, it is not particularly difficult to avoid using specific services such as Facebook that are known to undermine privacy, but consumers have very few choices for internet service providers. It's a virtual monopoly. Now, just generally speaking, what he's saying here is important because you have no escape. If you don't like the fact that Comcast will be selling your personal information, well, tough. You can't switch over to a different service because these companies like Comcast and Verizon, they hold monopolies. So you have no choice unless you just want to disconnect internet altogether. Now, it actually gets worse from here. So specifically, when we look at what they can sell financial and medical information, social security numbers, web browsing history, mobile app usage, even the content of your emails and online chats. And to make sure that this passed, Republican lawmakers are nuking the FCC privacy policy using a controversial legislative tool called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to nullify recently approved federal regulations. Resolutions of disapproval passed under the CRA cannot be filibustered and prohibit the agency in question, in this case the FCC, from adopting substantially similar privacy rules in the future. Now, what happened was after they voted to approve this measure, their offices were flooded with thousands of phone calls because their constituents were naturally outraged. However, they've decided to ignore those phone calls. They're not answering. Everything's going to voicemail. They're completely ignoring their constituents. And if you're wondering why these Republican sellouts would choose to allow Verizon and Comcast and AT&T to sell your social security number and sell your browsing history without your consent, well, the answer is simple. You just have to follow the money. And that's what we're going to do. So I want to point out a few familiar names. So in the Senate, Ted Cruz voted for this, and he took more than $40,000 from the broadband industry. We have Tom Cotton, also a supporter, took $70,000. Joni Ernst took almost $30,000. Lindsey Graham took $74,000. Mike Lee took $60,000, and John McCain took $84,000. And when you go to Mitch McConnell, he took $251,000 from the broadband industry, literally $250,000. Also, Lisa Murkowski took $66,000, Marco Rubio took $75,000, and in the House of Representatives, Joe Barton took $39,000. Representative Marsha Blackburn took $84,000. She's on par with some senators even. And I mean, we gotta take a moment here to send a special shout out to Representative Clay Higgins, who literally sold your online privacy for a measly $300 donation. And then Greg Walden of my state in Oregon took $155,000. Now, for every Republican scumbag that's on that list, you should be absolutely ashamed of yourself. However, they have no shame at all. They don't care how it looks. They are just ignoring constituents. So what you're going to have to do now is show up at their town halls and call them out. If they don't want to answer their phone calls, go to their town halls, show up in their office, and call them out for what they did, because if you put public pressure on them, then that always has a huge impact. Now, just to really show you the scope of anger that they've cultivated here, when you go to Breitbart and look at the comment section, even they're pissed off about this, rightfully saying that this is an attack against freedom. Now, seeing that Republicans are also subject to this, Max Temkin, who is the creator of Cards Against Humanity, actually vowed to buy the browser history of every single congressman and woman and congressional aide and publish it. So what this means is that to any Republican that voted for this that may have something to hide, who might have some skeletons in his or her closet, maybe something of the homosexual nature, I'm looking at you, Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, well, it looks as though you might have just screwed yourself, because we will be using this against you. You vote to sell out our data and think it's not going to impact you? No, we will use this against you, because if you think that it's okay for these large corporations to sell our social security numbers and our personal browsing history, well, we're going to do the same thing to you. Now, what you can do to avoid this is purchase a VPN. They should be ashamed of themselves, but again, they have no shame. These are scumbags. They're corporate sellout hacks who don't care about anyone but their donors.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.